Good afternoon, everyone, at least from where I am here in Loughborough. I am Cristian Vaccari, and I am the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Press Politics. Our journal publishes interdisciplinary research that sheds light on the relationship between media and politics in a cross-national perspective. This is our seventh conference, and it's the second time that we run this conference online rather than in person because of the pandemic. I think most of us would agree that we hope this is the last time, but at the same time, I am very, very excited about the conference we're going to have this year because as we did last year, we are going to be able to include a much broader spectrum of scholars from all around the world, both as presenters and as participants. And I very much look forward to the conversations we're going to have. I don't want to take up too much time, but I want to say some important things before we start. The first is a big thank you to all of you for a fantastic response to the conference. We had 167 proposals for papers to be presented at the conference. This was twice as many as last year, which was already our highest number ever.
Ele falou que teve mais,
people, please,
mais pessoas inscritas.
Can you please mute your microphones? Thank you. So we had the highest number ever of submissions, of which we have been able to accept 43, which is way more than we expected. And that's one of the reasons why this will be a very, very busy conference. Unfortunately, we're not going to have comfort breaks between the panels. And that is because I wanted to keep the times of the conference relatively short so that it doesn't take up too much of our time, but at the same time incorporate as many contributions as possible, both in the presentations and in the Q&A. We had more than 400 people who have now signed up to attend. Thank you for your interest from all around the world. If you know someone who you think might be interested, please forward to them the link to submit their registration, and I will be happy to send them the Zoom link today or in the next few days. Also, we had, as last year, a great response in terms of voluntary contributions. We have already raised more than £700 in voluntary registration fees. And again, a huge thank you to those of you who have been able to contribute. And finally, a huge thank you to Professor Yang Mi Kim, who will honor us with a keynote speech at the end of today's session. A few very brief guidelines on how our panels will run. Also, please refer to the email you have received where they are reported. But just to summarize very briefly, each panel will include 3 or 4 papers. For each paper, the presentation will be immediately followed by questions and answers. Each paper will have a total of 25 minutes, including of presentation and discussion. So if your presentation goes longer than the 12 to 15 minutes that we recommend, there will be less time for discussion. I've instructed each chair to carefully monitor the respect of these times and to facilitate the discussion, which will take place via the chat box on Zoom. So for those of you who are familiar with Zoom, there is a chat button. This is where you should post your comments, your questions, your reflections. Please be aware that we will not, unfortunately, be able to allow attendees to speak, people who are not presenting or who are not co-authors. We will not be able to allow them to speak live because the numbers would just not be manageable. But you have an opportunity to contribute to the discussion by using the chat. And the panel chairs will select the messages from the chat that they find to be most relevant and will ask the presenters to respond. Also, the nice thing about the chat is that it allows people to continue the conversation after the presentation has ended, and both in private direct messages and in public exchanges. A reminder that these proceedings are being recorded and all the videos will be made available on YouTube shortly after the end of the event. Now, the IJPP conference is not only about presenting relevant work that is conducted in the area of media and politics, but it's also about bringing our community to life. And there are various ways in which this community comes to life. One is through the conference, the other is through engaging with the journal. Another, which I think is very important, is through awarding important path-breaking work that is done in our field. And so before we begin, I want to briefly acknowledge to the winners of the two awards that the journal distributes each year. The first one is the, and again, please, may I ask people to keep their microphones on mute? Thank you very much. The first one is the Hazel Goddard Erskine Best Book Award, which honors the internationally oriented books published in the past 10 years. As was announced already at the ICA conference, but I think it's worth reminding this audience here, the winner for this year is Alyssa Richardson for her excellent book, Bearing Witness While Black, African-American Smartphones and the New Protest Journalism. And a second award that we instituted this year to honor Jay Blumler, who was not only a founder of our field, but a very good friend of the journal, and in particular, a very good friend of this conference. He attended every single editions of the conference when they were held in person. So he sadly passed away a few months ago, and we decided to create an award that recognizes the best article published in the previous calendar year in a print issue of the journal. And the winners of the first edition of the award are Edda Humprecht, Frank Esser, and Peter van Aalst for their articles titled Resilience to Online Disinformation, a Framework for Cross-National Comparative Research. I very warmly encourage you to read this fantastic contribution, which we have ungated for the next 12 months, meaning that you can read it for free, even if your university or institution doesn't have a subscription. It's also quite moving that tomorrow, an edited volume by Peter van Aalst, one of the co-authors, and Jay Blumler himself, on communicating around COVID is coming out with Routledge, and I think it's a nice coincidence that I want to acknowledge. Finally, I want to mention, and again, you will have seen this in your email, that to celebrate the conference and the possibility for international engagement that it brings us, we have created, refreshed a special collection on media and politics in the Global South and in global perspective, which includes 46 articles from all around the world about countries in the Global South or from scholars from the Global South. And all of these 46 articles will be free for everyone to download and read until the 1st of October. The link was in the email you received, but I'm also going to post that in the chat. I've already taken a few more minutes than I should have, for which I apologize. The other thing I should apologize is that, unfortunately, the last 2 days of this conference overlap with the Yom Kippur celebration. And this was a mistake that I made in scheduling the conference, for which I deeply and strongly apologize to everyone for whom it will be impossible to attend the conference on those days because they're observing this festivity. I will do my best to make sure that these errors don't happen again in the future. That being said, we now have a very exciting program to start with, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Alexandra Zugerberg from Uppsala University, who has kindly volunteered to chair the first panel of this conference, which is titled News and the Pandemic. Alexandra, I see you have already unmuted yourself, so please take it away.
Thank you, Cristian. And I want to start with thanking you for organizing such an interesting and inclusive conference. It's always a lot of work, but you put together a truly terrific program. So thank you. So welcome to the first panel on news and the pandemic. And we have 3 papers. And the first paper is on the psychological empowerment of solutions journalism with the authors Zhao, Daniel Jackson, Nguyen, and Antje Glück, and all from Bournemouth University. So I'm going to hand the floor to Sin, who I guess it will be presenting. And yes, you can share your screen. Excellent. And as Cristian just said, those of you listening, you can post your questions in the chat and I'll collect them. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cristian and Alexandra. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you again in the IJPP conference. My name is Zhao. So this is a work co-authored by with Professor Daniel Jackson, Professor Nguyen, and also Dr. Antje Glück, and all our authors are here today. So we are very happy to take any questions in the Q&A session. So the title of this paper is The Psychological Empowerment Potential of Solutions Journalism, the Perspectives from Pandemic News Users in the UK. So this is a part of the AHRC funded project. The title is COJO Against the COVID. Okay. We are developing this project because, in the journalism studies, there is a concern about the relationship between news audiences and also the disempowerment amongst the audiences. Because of the, the dominant problem-focused news narrative, which can result in the disempowered audiences from both the interpersonal and the interactional perspectives. For example, the declining mental health, and also the lack of the critical awareness and also the desensitization, which can have a detrimental effect on the civic engagement behaviors. And also the top-down structure of the news reporting. For example, some of the news reports, they don't really involve the audiences in their news reporting. They always portray the audiences as passive and apolitical, which have, both aspects actually have the negative implications for civic engagement and also the fulfillment of the democratic promise of journalism. So in recent years, solutions journalism has been proposed as an intervention to this problem-focused news narrative. So Zhao aims to empower the audience in the multi-layered way, including the interpersonal empowerment, for example, the emotions, increasing the positive effect of the audiences, and also the cognition, for example, enhancing the self-efficacy of the audience. And also the interactional empowerment in terms of the cognition, like informing the audiences about the possible solutions or the actual solutions to the problem, and also behavioral empowerment in terms of motivating actions among the audience. As a result, lots of researchers are actually interested in what are the exact effect of Zhao in audience empowerment. So we made a summary here. We can see some of the findings are very consistent in terms of the audience response to Zhao. Including the positive effect. For example, the audience respond that they get inspired, determined, attentive, and also active when they are exposed to Zhao, and also the greater engagement with the news. But actually in other aspects, for example, the critical awareness, the self-efficacy, and also the motivating actions are less consistent, which actually brings to the question. So the questions, therefore, remain over the democratic potential of Zhao, especially as it relates to the citizen empowerment. Theoretically, this means adopting a comprehensive framework that goes beyond the self-efficacy to include other dimensions of empowerment that have consequences for civic engagement in the public life. For such a task, we draw upon the theory of psychological empowerment, PE. So the definition of this psychological empowerment is the connection between the sense of personal competence, a desire for, and also a willingness to take action in the public domain. You can see actually from this notion or the explanation of PE, there actually includes several components of the empowerment. Includes the interpersonal component, that is the self-perceptions of control and competence to exert influence in a certain context. Interactional empowerment, so that is the knowledge of the socio-political environment in that context, what is surrounding you, and also the engagement behaviors to exert influence in that context, so that is the behavioral component. So informed by this theoretical framework, we ask this research question: how do news users evaluate the psychological empowerment potential of Zhao from interpersonal, interactional, and also the behavioral perspectives? We have adopted in-depth interviews with the 59 members of the UK public between 15 February and 3rd of March in this year. So we analyzed the data collaboratively on NVivo, and also we use a manual interpretive coding to analyze the data. What I want to point out here is that when we were having the interviews with the public, we actually asked their response to the potential of Zhao in psychologically empowering them in not only the general context, but also during this pandemic. And our findings actually in these two contexts, they are speaking to each other, which actually enhances the quality of our research findings. These are our research findings, and I'm really proud of this visualization. So you can see we have actually strong evidence of the potential of Zhao in psychologically empowering the audience from all these three perspectives. In each of the perspectives, there are actually some of the specific elements. For example, in the interpersonal empowerment, our audiences acknowledged the potential of Zhao in increasing their perceived control, especially their emotion, for example, boosting their morale, increasing their happiness and positivity, and also reducing anxiety. I have included some of the quotes from our interviewees, and I will show you some of the quotes later. And then another element of the interpersonal empowerment is the self-advocacy. So that is the cognition part of their empowerment. In terms of interactional empowerment, our participants acknowledge the potential of Zhao in helping them to focus debate on concrete ideas. So that is, I'm getting informed because I'm reading solution journalism, but also generating the informed debate. So I'm not only getting informed, but also I want to participate in the debate around the solutions, and also the behavioral empowerment. So that is stimulating the community involvement and also the coping behaviors. So next, I would like to show you some of the quotes from our interviews. Interpersonal empowerment, so increasing happiness and positivity, as you remember. So this is a part of the interpersonal empowerment. I don't have enough time to read each of the quotes, but I highlighted some of the keywords here. So I hope it's clear for you to see the opinions or the responses of our participants. So this one is Rebecca. Rebecca said, it could be really important for society to have the solutions, showing that not everything is rubbish, but with just a bit more positivity and trying to elicit a bit of hope and happiness and a future. The next one is interpersonal empowerment in terms of the reducing anxiety. This one is really typical because it talks about what is going on in this pandemic. Nigel said, Zhao will help people a lot psychologically, because I think there are still people have lots of anxiety regarding the virus and the vaccinations. So if the solutions journalism is providing an all-round story, it will give people the confidence to make certain decisions regarding particular things. So it will help them psychologically. In terms of the cognition, so that is the self-advocacy. So this one is coming from Nina. So Nina said, when you got the personal touch like Tom Moore, and the individuals going above and beyond, it is for the young people to see that somebody of his age standing there going, they can also do something to put their life into perspective. Another one is from the interactional empowerment. So this is actually about generating the informed debate. This one is actually really, really typical. So Helen is coming from Helen. Helen argued that Zhao could improve the quality of public policy debates during pandemic when biases and prejudices are prevalent, which will benefit civic engagement. She said, I think it will open up more informed debate at this moment. If somebody is really trying to find a solution, you debate around that solution to make it better. So I think actually it involves a wider audience in developing the solution. The last one, and I think I want to show you two quotes from the behavioral empowerment. Sophie said, Zhao might encourage me to become involved and also to inspire people to get together, to build the communities together and build back up to where they were pre-pandemic. And also Judy actually said something more specific about the problems during this pandemic, for example, unemployment, and also the loneliness of people during this pandemic. She said, this constructive approach to reporting the solutions would motivate people to make their own contributions. So these are the quotes. I just have selected these several quotes from our interviews to show the evidence of people acknowledging the potential of Zhao in psychologically empowering them. Which brings to our discussion. So our study actually finds that Zhao has the strong potential to psychologically empower the public, not only in the general context, but also during this pandemic in all these three layers. So given there is a strong link between psychological empowerment and also civic engagement, our study has important implications for the self-evident and also taken for granted problem-focused news practice. Our study actually called for both the academia and also the journalism industry to challenge the established practices to reconsider how to facilitate the conditions for active citizenship to thrive, and also thereby to imagine new ways to report the societal problems. But we can say actually currently, Zhao, although Zhao is actually has been experimented in certain parts of the newsrooms around the world, but it has actually not been mainstreamed yet. So our study has implications for the entire news industry is that Zhao deserves to be more seriously explored and developed as a nuanced element of newsroom operation and culture. That wraps up our presentation. Thank you for your listening, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent timing. So if you have questions, you can write them in the chat. There's a question in the chat from Serena about explaining more the theoretical framework of your research. I might add a question there also that could you say more about what defines solutions-oriented journalism more precisely? Yeah, okay. I can follow up.
Thank you for your questions. So I will start with the first one. Professor Dan and Professor Anne and also Dr. Antje also here. Please just feel free to jump in. So I will start with the first question. So the psychological empowerment, this theoretical framework. So this framework is actually is situated in the psychological studies, but it's different from individual empowerment or community empowerment. When you are looking at different kinds of theories of empowerment, there are some of the differences between these several notions. Psychological empowerment is more like that. It includes not only empowering yourself. For example, I just introduced, the interpersonal and the interactional. So, for example, your emotion, your self-efficacy, and also your understanding, your critical understanding of what is surrounding you. But also, so this is actually when you read some of the literature about empowerment, this is actually only summarized as the individual empowerment. But psychological empowerment is more like that. Based on top of that, you are also empowered to participate in taking actions. So I want to, for example, from the quotes I just included here, some of the participants, they also expressed their interest in taking actions to building the communities back into where they were pre-pandemic. So psychological empowerment to us is more like a comprehensive or all-around notion of empowerment, which can more comprehensively capture the potential of Zhao in really making a difference among the emotional part and also the cognition part of the audience. I hope I answered the question.
It seems like it. They can follow up with a comment if not.
Thank you. And then I just follow up with the question you answered, Alexandra. So your question, if I understand you right, is what is the solutions journalism? Am I right?
Yes, and what counts as that? Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your question. I saw Anne is showing himself on the camera. Anne is the PI of our entire project. I guess Anne might be the best one to answer this question. And do you want to?
Okay. Yeah. So I just want to make sure that everybody, when we interview the members of the public, that was actually, we didn't show them any solution journalism example or material. That was, we showed them in a video explaining what solution journalism is, and and how, what sort of topics that it cover, and how it what's the approach is. And the key thing is here is the solution basically is represent a shift from just the traditional way of looking at problems and leave it there. And then so here solutionism is looking at the problem, but also moving beyond that and talking about how people are responding to the problems. What do they do to overcome the problems? What are the limitations of that sort of solutions? What are the strengths of that? So so it's more a comprehensive and balanced approach to news, rather than just focus on the disaster or all of the negative things. And we ask the questions amidst the the peak of the pandemic in many ways, when people were really fed up with all the negativity news, in the media around COVID. We found a lot of evidence of people were just too tired of, and were in a situation where they feel hopeless and powerless in many ways. And this is where the solutionism concept came in and give people the sense of what it can do to help them to empower themselves, to improve their emotional well-being, to improve their motivation to take action, to be hopeful, to be be part of a brighter future. So that's basically what the concept of solutionism and how we approach that in the interviews.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So we have time for one more question. There are more questions in the chat, but one more, which is about the empowerment framework again. The empowerment literature often distinguishes between the mental state of empowerment and the empowerment in terms of outcomes. I'm wondering, right, Sue, how the participants related their experiences to outcomes, or if they didn't cover it much, how you as the research team interpreted these experiences in terms of outcomes.
Well, actually, this is actually concerns about the methodological part of our study. We actually leave these questions in a less fixed way. So we want to give space for our participants to have their own interpretations of what they think about the potential of solution journalism in empowering them. We didn't use like psychological empowerment because this is just too academic. And also we didn't specify different kinds of layers for them. So we just give them space to explore their understandings of the relationship between this type of journalism and also their mental and cognitive well-being. I hope I answered this question.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for this really interesting presentation. There are more questions in the chat. It would be, and people can keep writing them. So it would be great if you and your co-authors can keep monitoring that.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's also from Dan, co-author Dan Jackson, there's a reply about the Solutions Journalism Network and how they define everything as well. So we can move to a second presentation, which is on framing migration during the COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa. And here there are four authors: Thea de Gruchy, Thulie Zikhali, Zhao Vearey, all from the University of Witwatersrand, and Johanna Hanefeld from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So I'm going to turn the floor or give the floor to you.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Could someone just confirm that they can see?
I can see it.
They can see my screen. Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to present on this panel. My name is Thea de Gruchy. I'm a postdoc at the African Center for Migration and Society at Wits University in Johannesburg. And I'm going to take the next 10 to 15 minutes to share findings and reflections from a 12-month media monitoring project, which investigates the ways in which migration and migrant and mobile populations in South Africa are framed by the media in relation to COVID-19, specifically during the first year, 2020, of the pandemic. And this presentation draws on a manuscript that I've co-authored with Thulie, Zikhali, Joe Vearey, and Johanna Hanefeld. As I'm sure many of you are very aware, the Chinese origins of COVID-19, the relationship between human mobility and the spread of the virus, and the pressure that the pandemic has put on communities has led to an increase in incidents of xenophobia across the world. South Africa, which has a long history of both human mobility and xenophobia, has not escaped this trend as community and political leaders face pressure due to the pandemic. South Africa has what is often referred to as a mixed migration flow. So a significant number of South Africans themselves move internally. And in addition, about 7% of our population are non-citizens. And this includes refugees and asylum seekers, a wide variety of migrant workers, students, and the dreaded undocumented migrant. Unfortunately, non-citizens often face institutional or structural xenophobia as systems fail to be migration aware, and many of South Africa's migration and asylum policies and practices are themselves xenophobic and exclusionary. This is in addition to experiencing xenophobic sentiment and violence at the hands of South Africans, specifically in contexts in which local leaders scapegoat non-citizens for governance failures, using ideas about pregnant Zimbabweans, overburdening the healthcare system, or foreign men stealing South African women and jobs from South African men. Since the declaration of the national state of disaster in response to COVID-19 in March 2020, many of the challenges faced by non-citizens in South Africa have been exacerbated, and this includes xenophobic violence. In addition, non-citizens have largely been excluded from state responses to the pandemic, including social relief grants, and most recently, the vaccine rollout. Within this context, anticipating that the media would frame non-citizens in terms of undeservingness and exacerbate xenophobic tensions, something that the South African media has done historically and something that has and is being seen elsewhere, we undertook this study to look at the ways in which migrant and mobile populations were being framed, were being represented in news articles as the pandemic developed in 2020. There we go. Our project has a two-pronged approach. A news aggregator, Meltwater, was used to scrape the internet for articles published globally in 2020 that met a search criteria with key terms: migration, COVID-19, and South Africa. And here is our full search term. A total of 12,068 articles were identified and descriptively analyzed. We then conducted a deductive framing analysis on 561 articles. This was 10% of the sample once we'd accounted for republished articles. And I'm very happy to discuss this approach and the methods further in the discussion. This approach obviously produced an exorbitant amount of data, but today I want to focus on 4 findings that I believe are most relevant for the topic of this conference, which is the relationship between media and political processes. The focus of my reflections on how South African media is contesting the the focus of my reflections is on how the South African media is in fact contesting a long-standing relationship that it's had with political and community leaders and their xenophobic projects. So our first finding, so what we found through our analysis of the Meltwater data was that the location of publications mirrored geopolitical and social interest in and ties with South Africa. And I don't think that this is surprising. Due to the focus on English language media and the research, countries and regions that published news in English dominated our sample. But within this, 113 countries featured in our results across 2020, but the US, South Africa, and to some extent the UK were consistently the largest producers of news that met our search criteria. While, for example, only 73 articles were published from outlets based in Central and South America across the whole of 2020 that met our search criteria. I don't think any of that is particularly surprising, but I did want to highlight that. Our second finding was that there is a body of literature on the ways in which xenophobia has been perpetuated by the South African media. Given this, we had anticipated seeing publications that were inflammatory and xenophobic in nature, and that included inaccurate information about migrant and mobile populations. Interestingly, however, only 25 of the 561 articles that we conducted a framing analysis on were identified as being xenophobic. Some of these articles argued quite explicitly that foreigners should be excluded from the economy, or that illegal migrants would put South Africans at risk of COVID, whilst others used the term illegal uncritically. And we include these in that number of xenophobic articles because, as noted by Pepperdy, the depiction of African migrants as illegal aliens and illegal immigrants implies both criminality and difference. The persistent use of illegal to describe undocumented migrants suggests a close connection with crime and criminal acts. In addition, in only 14 of the articles that we analyzed, did we identify concerns about inaccuracies in the data presented. Articles that were identified included the inflation of numbers, specifically in relation to non-citizens in informal settlements and in the economy, and the incorrect use of the term human trafficking. However, incorrect, misleading, or inflammatory comments about migration were not widespread in the articles that we analyzed. The third finding of interest relates to the close association between mobility and the spread of COVID-19. Mobility, including local mobility within cities, was consistently presented as a key way in which COVID-19 spreads. Travel bans and restrictions were therefore framed as the logical response to the pandemic. However, in writing about the effects of travel restrictions on communities, articles clearly and consistently articulated the power and importance of mobility in the lives of many in the region by showing how without the ability to move, many lost their jobs, their livelihoods, and their food securities. And here's a quote from one of the articles included in our sample. Zivu says the coronavirus has put many cross-border traders in a dire situation. Many live a hand-to-mouth existence and must sell goods to earn money, he says. Closing the border with South Africa has left the traders and workers who support them vulnerable and without money to pay for rent, school fees, or even food. Zivu likens it to a natural disaster. So here we see an example of an article, the kind of article that we see consistently across 2020 that actively contests the sort of obvious response to COVID-19 travel bans due to the impact on mobility-dependent communities and on migrants. Finally, the use of the pandemic to further state sanction xenophobia was a key component in the framing of the state across 2020. The South African state was portrayed as powerful through its ability to impose lockdowns, the general callousness it displayed towards vulnerable groups, including migrants, and displays of force. Simultaneously, however, the state was also portrayed as relatively powerless in response to COVID-19 and to really put a stop to human mobility. While there was little consensus on how the government should respond to either COVID-19 or migration, the state was seen as failing to respond to both adequately, in addition to being responsible for a plethora of related issues. Within this framing, the South African state was seen as being in conflict not only with migrants, but also with its own citizenry, industry, COVID-19, and most interestingly, with itself. In various articles, different parts of the South African state are seen in conflict with one another. A key example of this being in relation to a refugee community in Cape Town. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but the first part of it says, Home Affairs, which is a national department, and the City of Cape Town, which is a local administration, are engaged in a blame game over who should shoulder responsibility for the repatriation or deportation of refugees and asylum seekers who have been left in limbo. Stories about this particular issue and similar issues were seen across 2020, highlighting how the state was failing migrant communities during the pandemic, rather than what we're used to seeing in the media in South Africa, which is stories about how non-citizens, about how migrants are the reason that the state is failing citizens. So we're really seeing a different kind of story about migrants in 2020 in South Africa. Our data and analysis thereof differs from much of the body of literature on how media portrays migrants and migration in South Africa. Existing work argues and shows that the media has played a key role in the proliferation of xenophobic ideas in South Africa and in xenophobic violence itself. Although the causal link between newspaper articles and xenophobic violence has been contested both academically and legally in South Africa, the role of the media in contributing to the xenophobic climate here is seldom disputed. Our research, however, suggests that some renegotiation of the ways in which the media has traditionally portrayed migrants and migration in South Africa, traditionally it has played into the hands of the state, has clearly taken place. While xenophobic pieces were present in our sample, articles that were sympathetic to migrants and the situations within which migrant and mobile populations found themselves during the pandemic and South Africa's restrictive approach to migration were far greater in number. The consistent writing and publication of migrant interest stories that reflect the importance of mobility for many in the region and are critical of the South African state's current approaches to migration management suggest that the media is contesting what Moyo and Mpofu call democratic thinking as a framework for understanding the foreign other. This is at the same time that social media sites are emerging as a key avenue through which politicians and community leaders share xenophobic ideas and incite and organize violence, something that we saw a lot of towards the end of 2020 in South Africa. Further research is needed into news published in other languages and into understanding why news outlets are publishing less inflammatory and more sympathetic content. But our research suggests that during the pandemic, what has been written about migration and about migrants has changed, and that traditional media outlets are distancing themselves from state-sanctioned and/or community-led xenophobic projects and contesting obvious responses to the pandemic, like travel bans, due to their impact on migrants and on cross-border mobility. Thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. So everyone can write comments in the chat. Can I start by asking you, this goes beyond your study, but what's your understanding? Is this a shift that you might have seen anyway, or is it a very sort of crisis pandemic related shift that it's coming out into the open?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it may have been a shift that we would have seen anyway. In the last 10 years, a lot of work has been put in by researchers and activists to improve the quality of reporting on issues of migration and on migrant and mobile populations. So I do think that there has been a longer term shift. There's sort of a cohort of journalists that have kind of emerged over the last few years that publish and write specifically on migration, or that is one of the issues in which they're very interested in. So I think that what we saw in 2020 and still see now is part of a longer term shift. But I do think that there's something about the pandemic which allowed the very particular way in which migrant communities were being spoken about to change quite drastically. And maybe that's just also because suddenly there were a lot more articles being published about human mobility, right? So there was a lot more of a chance for people to change how they were talking about migrant and mobile populations.
It's interesting. I don't see any questions in the chat. Is it your impression that it's different then in the social media, as you mentioned at the end? Do you want to expand?
Yeah, the social media is very, very different. In the last couple of years, social media in South Africa has become quite disconnected from traditional media outlets, and we're seeing a lot of what I think has been more commonly understood as and sort of American landscape in terms of social media. We're seeing a lot of that now happening in South Africa. So quite strident communities, developing and talking to themselves with a particular political project, some of which is directly linked to American political projects. So there was some interesting analysis of social media networks in South Africa that was published last year, which showed links with MAGA supporters and that sort of political community in the US. I think a lot of misinformation around COVID-19 is shared across national borders, and we're seeing a lot of similar stuff that you would see, say, in the US cropping up in South Africa. But yes, the social media has become a site for inciting violence and also organizing it. And we saw a lot of that towards the end of 2020, actual, real details of like where to go. This protest is happening here. We'll be protesting against foreigners in the economy at this place, like meet here at this time. So social media really emerging as a key avenue for that.
So a question from Cristian in the chat. What is the role of political actors in contributing to the frames you saw in the data? Did your research try to isolate the frames proposed by politicians and reported by journalists from those proposed by journalists?
That's a really good question, Cristian. And no, our analysis didn't specifically look at whether, who was proposing the particular the particular representation or frame of migrants or migration, but rather what was being said in the article as a whole. And so we did find that there were articles that would say, quote, our former Minister of Finance said something quite xenophobic about this time last year. And so there were some articles that sort of just reported that. And then there were other articles that reported and contested that. But the way that we analyzed it was as being a contestation of that, that xenophobia being perpetrated by a political leader. So we didn't sort of, we didn't keep track of what politicians were saying and then what journalists were saying, but we did, in analyzing the whole article, it's quite clear the moments at which, and the spaces in which, because publications also differ, what political leaders were saying was contested, and when it wasn't contested, when it was simply sort of repeated, as it were.
So another question from Jason Searle in chat. You mentioned a difference between the framing of migrants between the media and the political actors or public opinion. Do you think there are any issues that this raises for the media?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not a media studies person, so this is sort of, not. Yeah, so just bear that in mind in terms of this comment. I'm not obviously plugged into the broader conversations that are happening around this topic, but I think, that quote I included at the end about contesting democratic thinking, I think it does raise some issues for the media if the democratic thinking is the othering of foreigners and the media is actively distancing itself from that. I think you're going to see people distancing themselves from the media, right? And we are starting to see a lot of that in South Africa, something that we've seen elsewhere in the world, where people read particular news outlets, and that is where they get their news. And, so the kind of news you're getting differs very greatly depending on which news outlet you get. But I don't, at the same time, I think another thing that's happened in South Africa is that in the last couple of years, there's been a proliferation of writing of like op-eds by activists, by researchers, by sort of community members. And I think that that has also created more of an environment or a sense of like, not everyone is demonizing non-nationals, not everyone is anti-migration. And so it's helped to sort of break some of the sort of like the prior to that, the sort of monolithic, ness of like xenophobia perpetuated by news outlets. I think giving a voice through op-eds to other people who have different perspectives, who researchers, who activists, that kind of thing, who migrants themselves, has definitely helped create more of a sense that not everyone is part of this sort of like anti-immigrant feeling. But yeah, I'm not sure what the longer term implications of this will be. I'm not sure whether people read articles that they can see are going to be sympathetic to migrants if they themselves don't feel sympathetic to migrants. It's very difficult to tell, and definitely I think something in which more research needs to be done.
Okay, and thank you for the reply, says Jason. A final question from Ricardo Fabrino. Thank you for the presentation. Has the study found specific frames around gender and migration? How are migrant women framed in this context?
Thanks for this question, Ricardo. It's a very important question, and it actually, I'll be better placed to answer it further down the line. Gender has come up. I mean, as I mentioned, we have an exorbitant amount of data that's been produced by this research project. Interestingly, gender hasn't come up as like a key finding. So our intention is to specifically look at the ways in which gender has been framed, specifically in these migrant interest stories, because across 2020, there's so many of these stories that look at like a particular community of migrants. So for example, blind Zimbabwean migrants in the Johannesburg inner city, disabled migrants wanting to be repatriated home, women, domestic workers, and I think that when we actually do it, I think there's going to be a really interesting analysis there around the ways in which gender, as well as like disability and then migrant status, are all like brought together to frame these stories and really try and engender sympathy. But as of yet, we haven't done that deep dive, that kind of analysis. So forthcoming, I hope.
No, that sounds interesting. Thank you, and thanks for this interesting paper. And interesting with studies that sort of find something different from what they perhaps thought they were going to find to begin with. I mean, that's exciting. And it's interesting also in relation to the next paper, where seems to be a different relationship with between the media and the state sources. Our third paper and final paper is on YouTube as a source of information about unproven drugs for COVID-19 in the context of Brazil, the role of mainstream media and recommendation algorithms in promoting misinformation. And the authors are Felipe Bono Soares, Igor Salgueiro, Carolina Bonotto, and Otávio Vinhas. And many of you are at different universities, but also all at the Media's Research Laboratory for Research on Media, Discourse and Social Networks, located at the Federal University of Pelotas. So Felipe, I'll give the floor to you and invite you to share your screen.
Thank you, Alexandra. So just share my screen. Please let me know if there is any issues or something wrong. Hello, everyone. I'm Felipe, and today I'm going to present our study focused on YouTube and hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, both proven drugs for COVID-19. In particular, focusing on the Brazilian context. This study was co-authored by Igor Salgueiro, Carolina Bonotto, and Otávio Vinhas. They are also here. And so why we decided to look at YouTube? It's, of course, a very popular platform around the globe. and the same is true for Brazil. It's often used for news consumption, but is also somehow understudied, probably because of the videos and the type of content. So we decided to look at this platform to understand how it was used for promoting misleading information about health, and in particular COVID-19. Why looking at chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine? Well, they are both unproven drugs for COVID-19. Nevertheless, they were heavily promoted by Bolsonaro and many politicians in Brazil. Bolsonaro is Brazilian president, of course, and also many of his supporters. And current investigations found out evidence of irregular use of public resources to produce chloroquine tablets, as well as politicians being paid to promote these drugs, and also doctors to prescribe them. So these two drugs were a key topic of myths and disinformation in the country. To guide this study, we created two research questions. The first one was more general, trying to understand how pro-hydroxychloroquine content was propagated on YouTube. And based on literature review and the methods we used, we created two hypotheses for this one. The first one was that most pro-HCK videos would be posted from the mainstream media. For two reasons, we created this hypothesis. First, because we used YouTube's API based on keywords, search keywords, to collect our data. And YouTube's API use the search algorithms from the platform to provide data. So we expected to receive videos from channels with more subscribers and more popular channels as well. Also, previous studies and other analyses also identify that the Brazilian mainstream media often helped to promote these drugs in the country. So that's why we expected to see many pro-HCK videos from the mainstream media. We also expected to see more views and interactions among pro-HCK videos compared to anti-HCK videos. Once again, for two reasons. First, because previous studies identified that often myths and disinformation often generate a lot of interaction. And previous analysis on other social media platforms like YouTube, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram also identified that often pro-HCK content generated more interaction than anti-HCK content. We also wanted to explore the role of YouTube's recommendation system and how these could create echo chambers or rabbit holes or any metaphor you would rather use. So our first hypothesis, based once again in previous studies, was that YouTube was more likely to suggest videos containing the same type of content, so to follow homophily in the suggestions. And the second one, that this effect would be stronger among pro-HCK videos. So for data collection, as I said, we used YouTube's API. We created a search query based on two keywords, hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine, both in Portuguese. We collected first an initial seed of 500 videos, and all these recommended videos, all videos that were recommended in this initial seed. But then we noticed that many videos were unrelated to these drugs. So we decided to clean our data. And for the final data set, we included only videos that contained hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine in the title. To analyze this data, we first used content analysis with 3 independent coders. We watched all these videos to code the type of content, whether it was pro-HCK, anti-HCK, or sometimes without a clear position, for example, from videos from chemical teachers talking about the properties of these drugs, but unrelated to the discussion about the pandemic, and also the type of channel that was posting these videos. We also used social network analysis to explore a recommendation network that was built based on the suggested videos from our data set. And we used two metrics to explore homophily and clusterization of these videos. So our results, as expected, we found out that most pro-HCK videos were indeed posted by mainstream media. And we also identified that most mainstream media videos contained pro-HCK content. So this indicates that Brazilian mainstream media in special, but mainstream media in general, was somehow promoting these drugs. Regarding interaction, we identified that pro-HCK videos received more views and also more comments and likes, all with statistical significance, while anti-HCK videos received more dislikes, which is in general a negative type of interaction, but without statistical significance. But then based on this result, we thought maybe pro-HCK videos could have been posted by more popular channels, channels with more subscribers. So we decided to explore this issue as well. And we looked at channels that posted both pro and anti-HCK videos. We selected the 4 channels with the most videos that posted both types of content and compared these metrics once again. We identified that even in these channels, pro-HCK videos received more views in all the 4 channels, in 2 out of 4 with statistical significance. And pro-HCK videos also received more likes than anti-HCK videos in all 4 cases with statistical significance. This, of course, is just an exploration, but this result indicates that it was a matter of content, which type of content was produced in the video, rather than more popular channels posting pro-HCK videos. Regarding homophily and clusterization, we actually didn't find any strong evidence of homophily in the recommended videos. The EI index for the entire network, which basically compares the number of internal and external connections, whether a video suggested other video containing the same content or another type of content, was very close to 0, which indicates that both possibilities were similarly alike. However, pro-HCK videos were indeed more likely to suggest other pro-HCK videos, as we identified a negative EI index. Also, pro-HCK videos had a higher clustering coefficient, which means they were more interconnected. So although this wasn't a very strong tendency, they could create some of internal or more dense network in which a YouTube user would watch one pro-HCK video and continue watching more and more of this type of content. But we wanted to understand why this result was different for pro-HCK videos. And then we decided to test how often these videos were suggested by YouTube in our data set. And we discovered that YouTube was more likely to recommend pro-HCK videos than anti-HCK videos, once again with statistical significance in the comparison of these 2 types of videos. Therefore, YouTube was somehow promoting pro-HCK content. Once again, we thought, okay, maybe this is related to popularity, numbers of views of these videos. So we decided to test the correlation between views and the number of times these videos were recommended in our data set. And although we identified a positive correlation, this was a bit too weak. So we understand that views was not a key influence in the number of suggestions. But in general, these results indicate that YouTube somehow helped to promote pro-HCK content. Just to sum up then, we identified two key actors, very important to the promotion of unproven drugs on YouTube. And the first one is the Brazilian mainstream media. This is a problem because, of course, mainstream media has a large audience. So many people watch these videos and watch free-to-air TV channels, for example. And the mainstream media, some of these channels are among the most trusted brands in Brazil, as these three examples that altogether posted over 100 videos containing pro-HCQ content. So this is a problem because many people gonna watch these videos and gonna watch this content and believe that these unproven drugs could help for treating or even preventing COVID-19. Many of these videos contain parts of programs broadcasted by free-to-air TV channels, and this indicates a larger ecosystem of misinformation. And also many videos contained interviews with politicians and health specialists, or parts of speeches, social media lives, or interviews from Bolsonaro, in which, of course, he promoted these drugs. And secondly, as I just said, YouTube, and in particular, the recommendation algorithms helped to promote pro-HCQ content. Additionally, we collected our data in March this year, and roughly a month later, in April this year, YouTube announced that they were removing videos in Portuguese about unproven drugs. So we decided to see how it went, and we revised our data set and identified that over 90% of pro-HCQ videos from our data set are still available. And even the 10% that was removed or unavailable or private received over 4 million views before they were excluded or removed from the platform. Therefore, YouTube's actions were too little and too late. If you have any comments, suggestions, questions, we will love to hear it from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. And thanks for that interesting paper. There's a question from Marcelo Santos, which is, if there are signs of studies that suggest any kind of automated activity, such as views or likes, on the YouTube data, or if they believe the results are drawn from purely organic activity. Alternatively, if there seem to be no means to check that.
Thanks, Marcelo. That's a very interesting question. And I'm not aware of any study indicating automated activity. I'm actually not aware of any study looking at this topic and this issue. So I don't know, but other studies in Brazil in particular found evidence of automated activity on Twitter, Facebook. So there might have some influence on that. And as we identified that the number of views and recommendation had a weak correlation, probably these videos were posted on other social media platforms as well. And in this case, even though there might not have any automated activity to increase views or likes on YouTube, automated activity on other social media platforms might have helped to increase the number of views and likes and comments. But that's a very interesting question, and I'm sorry, I don't know the exact answer because I'm not aware of any study of this kind.
Oh, that's interesting. Ricardo Fabrino has the comment, I have been conducting research on Brazilians' anti-vax YouTube videos, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to reach this content as the recommendation algorithms redirect users to quote unquote trustworthy content. Did you also face any changes throughout the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ricardo. And indeed, it seems that YouTube is trying to redirect users to mainstream media channels and to trustworthy channels. And that's even the reason we created that hypothesis that most of pro-HCQ content would come from the mainstream media. As we used YouTube's API, the data collection was totally automated and provided by the YouTube's API. So we even discussed that maybe for future studies, we could identify these more alternative videos and these far-right channels, and use another way for data collecting, for example, based on videos ID and channels ID, to select these very alternative, very radicalized content, and then try to identify another ecosystem. Because probably no, certainly our research was influenced by how YouTube promotes more trustworthy content and trustworthy channels. And that's, of course, a limitation, but in our case, it was also interesting because we could identify this role of the mainstream media. But you're totally right, and YouTube tends to promote this trustworthy content. And unfortunately, we cannot know more about the darker content, the more radicalized content from these anti-vax channels and the far-right channels. And many of them also excluded content as well. So yeah, it's definitely a limitation for our study.
So several questions here. From Tatiana Koto, is it possible to identify the main frames and arguments surrounding the pro-hydro, however it's pronounced?
So yes, I guess. As we, the authors, watched the videos to code, we decided that as this was a very polarized topic, and so we decided to code the videos ourselves. We could identify the main frames. Often is, of course, the idea heavily promoted by Bolsonaro that we don't know if this works, but it's better try than do nothing. So often the frame to promote these drugs is like, okay, we are at least trying to do something, or we are at least trying to cure people. And we know that there is no scientific validation just yet, but we have our experience in hospitals and doctors saying that it works. So often they use this argument. And many mainstream media videos included journalists or TV presenters saying, okay, I have a cousin that had COVID and he took chloroquine and now he's just great. So it definitely works. And this was actually the same argument used by Bolsonaro when he was infected. He said, okay, I just took a few tablets of chloroquine and I feel great. I most certainly this works. So these are some of the main frames. Sometimes we find some pseudoscience and like, okay, there is this or that study proving that a few people tested and we have great results. But more often is just like these sort of mythopoieses and these illustrative examples and a few cases of people that took chloroquine and recovered from COVID.
Yeah. So I think you're starting to answer the questions that there are two questions that are similar. How you explain the actions of the mainstream media in promoting this and political influences or lack of critical science reporting or something else from Nguyen, and also from Teresa Wakeman, the supply side of the disinformation. Where does the false information originate? You did start to reply to this, but is there anything more you want to add there?
Yeah, so Bolsonaro is certainly a key source of misinformation and disinformation in the country. And most disinformation campaigns related to unproven drugs and other topics related to COVID started from him. And regarding the mainstream media, we have a few of these channels are more similar to Fox News. They have a very conservative leaning, but we also have, for example, Wall, which is an online platform, and often they just posted a part of Bolsonaro live on Facebook in which he said, okay, chloroquine is amazing and it works, but they didn't say nothing like, okay, there are no evidence of that chloroquine works or anything. So part of this mainstream media was probably trying to promote and believed that chloroquine worked, but also part of this mainstream media was just reproducing parts of speeches and interviews and didn't say anything like, okay, this is false, this is misinformation, or scientific studies showed that these drugs do not work. So it's two different types of influence of the mainstream media in this case. And the lack of, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, go.
No, the lack of critical sense science reporting, yeah, it happens sometimes. For example, those 4 channels that we tested that posted both pro and anti-HCQ content, we understand that journalists and the channels, they knew that these drugs didn't work. Sometimes they created content showing that these drugs do not work, but sometimes they just post this 1-minute video with Bolsonaro saying something about the drugs, or some interview or some influencer saying something about these drugs. So it was, I guess, a bit of clicktivism, or clickbait, just to receive views and to say, okay, Bolsonaro said this bizarre sentence and we posted here, so we received loads of views in our videos.
So finally, a comment from Marcelo that it might be interesting to code the media sympathetic to Bolsonaro and those that supposedly maintained independence.
Yeah, indeed. In this initial coding, we decided to simply say, okay, mainstream media, because we expected that the number of pro-HCQ content would be lower, even though we expected to see many, the most pro-HCQ videos coming from mainstream media. We expected to see that mainstream media posting more anti-HCQ content. But it's definitely a good idea and something that we might do in the future, because it's quite different to see, as Marcelo said, a few of these more conservative and right-wing mainstream media in Brazil and how different they are from other mainstream media channels.
We have to round off the discussion here, but there are more comments in the chat that you can come back to. Thank you for this really interesting paper, and thanks to all of you 3 presenters representing your teams for this terrific panel.